Hi everyone, it's good to see you all. I hope you're doing well. I'm so sorry not to be with you in the classroom, but I'm excited to begin the first of our Ancient Persia video lectures together. And I hope that you'll be able to watch these along with the readings, along with the lecture notes, and at least get some sense of what we were going to cover in each of our classes for this second half of this very strange semester. Today we're going to be talking about the ancient Persian military. You all know this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I'm currently working on in my own research. And what I'm going to try to do in this short talk is to sketch over some of the basic framework of what we know. Obviously, there are a lot of unanswerable questions about the Persian military due to our lack of Achaemenid narrative sources. But we have a range of different types of evidence that can tell us a good bit about how the Persian military worked and can allow some educated guesses about parts of its organization system. As we're going to see over the next few classes, this will be deeply relevant to Persia's engagement in foreign wars beyond the imperial frontier, and especially the wars that are best attested in our written sources. That is the Persian-Greek Wars in the 5th century BCE. So let's start out. What I want to think about today first is the logistics and infrastructure of the Persian Empire and how these facilitate military movement. Whenever you have a military operation in the ancient world or the modern, logistics are fundamentally important. How is an army supplied? How fast can it reach its destinations? How does it manage to overcome geographical challenges, communications challenges, intelligence gathering challenges in order to carry out a successful operation? It's clear that the ancient Persians were masters of the art of military logistics. And this is an area in which we're relatively well informed by our sources. Even if we don't have Persian records describing military campaigns in detail, the sorts of information that survive on travelers in the Persepolis fortification archives and our evidence from Persepolis and Greek sources on the Persian road system all give the impression of an imperial movement network that is designed to facilitate the rapid concentration of troops from the center to the frontier. So we've mentioned before the royal road system, and a few notes are important about the royal roads. The system is described in detail by Herodotus, who describes one of its branches, the road that travels 1,600 miles between Sardis in Anatolia and Susa in Elam. Herodotus calls this the royal road, but we know it's not the only one. It's simply a branch on a much wider imperial highway network. There are royal roads that stretch between Susa and Persepolis, and then out to Bactria and Arachosia in the east, to Memphis, Egypt in the southwest, certainly to Babylon, as well as to the Anatolian frontier. So, with the messenger service, as we've seen, the Persian kings can communicate rapidly with their frontiers. Based on Henry Colburn's reconstruction, we think that a messenger can get from Susa to Sardis or Memphis in approximately 12 days. And that meant that out and back communication of a royal dispatch and response could take place in the course of a single month. Now, troop movement of course, is much slower. If a messenger can travel about 140 miles a day using the Achaemenid horse relay system, a typical ancient army is limited by the movement rates of its slowest foot soldiers and its baggage train. We know from Persepolis, the fortification tablets, that large travel groups on the royal roads often travel with mules or horses, sometimes with camels, in order to carry supply. Those using extensive camel forces might have been able to move a little bit faster. Camels can travel farther on less resources. But horses and mules are more common for large groups. So an army with this sort of baggage transport could go a typical pace between 10 and 15 miles a day, depending on the terrain they're traveling. If they have to go through a mountain pass or cross any kind of major bridge, that's going to funnel them into a very narrow spot, and it's going to slow down the movement of the overall column. So overall, if a messenger can get to the frontier from the center in 12 days, an army might travel from the frontier to the center or vice versa in about 4 or 5 months. You also have to work in rests, times for the army to regroup and resupply, time for the baggage animals to be rested so that they're not simply worked to death. So some logistics math can help us think about the challenges that the Persian army, just like any ancient Greek or Roman army, would face. We know from Persepolis and Herodotus that the standard ration of a Persian soldier was about 1.5 liters of grain flour. That would be usually wheat or barley flour. If you put that in a cup and weighed it, that would be about 1.85 pounds of flour that could be made into grain cakes. It could be made into pancakes. It could be baked as bread if they have a longer period of time to rest. So if you have an army of 50,000 men, that's going to require a daily flour ration of 92,000 pounds of flour. Every man also requires a half gallon of water per day on average. That's a standard modern estimate for the water needs of active soldiers. So again, an army, if it has 50,000 men, would require 25,000 gallons per day of fresh water. Each horse would require about 20 pounds of mixed grain fodder or grazing, hay, grass, etc., and would require at least 8 gallons of fresh water. So there are massive amounts of quantities required for the movement of any large military force in the ancient world. How did the Persians' infrastructure help them deal with this? Well, here the road system and the supply depots can play a critical role. We think that the Persian road system has depots stretched out, every day's march or so, all along the thousands of miles worth of royal highway network. That means that armies moving along the royal road, just like the traveling court, or occasionally if you have a royal campaign, you have the traveling court and a large army moving together, they can stop regularly and refill their rations from these storehouses, meaning that they do not have to transport all their food and water supplies with them. And that's going to be critical for a successful military movement. Now, we also know that whenever there's a large campaign beyond the frontier, Achaemenid military forces converge on a starting point from many different directions. The idea is to keep the groups small, feed them on different royal road branches as they move towards the concentration point, minimize the logistical costs as much as possible until you get to the point where you want the whole army moving together. Now, at a concentration point along the frontier, we have evidence, especially from Herodotus, who describes this process before Cambyses' invasion of Egypt, and especially before Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Before Xerxes' army moved out in 480, Persian stockpiling along the frontier had been going on since 483. That is almost 3 years worth of preparation of supplies for the concentration of a very large army in one place. The idea was that the elements of the army could converge, in this case at Sardis, Then they could move to the Hellespont, cross into Europe, and pick up supplies from these enormous depots that had been set up in European Thrace and up to the border of Macedonia. Eventually, once they went beyond imperial infrastructure, Achaemenid armies would have to improvise other means of supply. And there, in the invasions of Greece, it's clear that they used ship-borne convoys to keep bringing food over to Greece to try to keep the army working as it moved farther and farther outside the realm of the Achaemenid supply system. So this is the supply network. Again, more work continues to be done, but there's good information in Greek authors like Herodotus and at a later date Xenophon and the Alexander historians on supplies and army movement that can be applied to our understanding of known Achaemenid armies moving across known distances in certain locations. Now, what about the organization of the Persian army? The first thing to know is that Greek sources give a clear distinction between a sort of standing army comprising royal guards. Again, Darius in the Bisitun inscription refers to armies in the palace at certain key imperial sites. Those would probably make up what you could think of as the elite or the core of any large Persian military force. But they would have to be augmented for major military operations. You would have a standing permanent army on the one hand, if you like, the royal guards. On the other hand, you would have to add forces on to put together a big army for a frontier campaign. And you could do that in a few different ways, including hiring of mercenary soldiers or the conscription or drafting of different types of soldiers in the provinces. So here we're at the mercy of scattered fragments of sources. We don't have one good source that describes the organization of the Achaemenid military or the training or recruitment of its soldiers in detail. But we do have a number of references to soldiers that we can start to put together to look at how some of the pieces would work. First of all, in the Persepolis fortification archives, there's a growing recognition among scholars that we have several different terms for soldiers that appear in different types of supply and travel documents at Persepolis. The most common term is the Elamite word tashup. Translates into a Persian word kara. That's your generic term for soldiers. Unfortunately, it also is a generic term meaning people. The people can also equal the army, the masses. And therefore, when it shows up in Persepolis, we're not seeing records of actual military campaigns. You get travel texts that talk about rations for groups of tashup. But the question is this a generic way of saying travelers, free, non-Kurtash people who are moving on the road? Or is it a specific designation for groups of soldiers? It's often hard to tell. As a rule, though, I think that it's safe to say when you get very large groups of tashup moving, when you see in several tablets there are several hundred tashup, or in a few tablets up to 2,000 tashup moving hundreds of miles at a time and getting supplies along the road. When that occurs, I think that we're probably looking at soldier groups. Tashup seem to be distinguished as different than Kurtash or workers. And I think that soldiers are the best explanation for large group travel dynamics. So we can track some of the Tashup texts. They can give us information about, in some cases, movement rates and supply rates for larger groups of Persian soldiers. There are also a few Aramaic tablets that have not yet been fully published, but they seem to use terminology that is a bit more explicitly military. They will refer to groups of people referred to as a hyla. And a hyla is the Aramaic term for a military unit. It would translate to something like brigade or division. We have a few texts where hyla are moving. Sometimes they actually use an Aramaic term that basically translates to general for a figure who's moving with a hyla. And unfortunately, these receipts, the ones that have come out so far, seem to be limited to 1 or 2 lines each. So again, they don't tell us much about the context for these military units moving. We do also see some other types of military references, though, in the Persepolis tablets. There are a number of travel journals that show people called fortress guards that are moving from one royal palace site to another, separate from the king. This seems to be connected to some sort of either recruitment or reinforcement program that's going on, for example, at Ecbatana in Media, where we see travel of fortress guards coming and going between Ecbatana and Persepolis. There are also an increasing number of references to people called spear bearers. Spear bearer is also the term used to describe Gaubaruva, the famous noble who is depicted next to Darius's tomb at Nakshi Rustam, and who was Darius's original father-in-law. We don't know if Gaubaruva being a spear bearer, if that may be a reference to a sort of general rank. Was he the chief spear bearer in charge of the Persian army? That's getting a little speculative. However, spear bearers in Persepolis appear only in small groups. They seem to get a regular ration. There's nothing that suggests that they are elite and raised above other Tashup who get the same amount of food per day. But the spear bearers, when we see them, they're often operating in groups of 4 or 6 at a time. They typically are involved in survey missions. Sometimes we get texts that say 4 or 6 spear bearers have showed up as auditors or as inspectors to count courtage or to inspect resources at storehouses. We also see spear bearers involved in road survey. In some cases, the royal family is on the move. Spear bearers move ahead of them and are said to be counting the miles or clearing the road ahead of the royal party. So the spear bearers certainly are tied to the royal army and to the movement of the court, but we see them fulfilling non-military functions or extended functions at Persepolis. In addition to spear bearers, 2 other possible types of soldiers include the imperial guides, who are assigned to travel parties along the royal road, and the pira dazish, or express messengers, who carry the king's messages along the highways. Interestingly, we're starting to find a overlap in personnel. We're starting to find tablets in which the same individual shows up in some places as a guide and in other places as a messenger, or in some places as a guide and in other places as a spear bearer. This has led Wouter Henkelmann to suggest that guides and spear bearers might be part of the same professional service corps that supports the king. In other words, there may be a role for these people, guides, messengers, spear bearers, as part of a standing army in the Achaemenid world. I am tempted to speculate that these sorts of permanent military personnel or service personnel might be connected with the group of Persian soldiers that Herodotus calls the Immortals. When Herodotus describes the Persian army that invaded Greece in 480 BC, he talks about the masses, but then some elite units. He says that Xerxes is accompanied by 2,000 noble cavalry, picked from the finest of the Persians, and a corps of 10,000 Persian infantry called Immortals. They're given this name supposedly because their ranks are always kept up to full strength, to the number of 10,000. And Herodotus says that if any of them dies or leaves the service, another is immediately recruited to take their place. This looks like a professional army. We don't know about its training. We don't know if it should be viewed as an elite in terms of fighting techniques. But this seems like a possible fit with the sorts of long-term serving soldiers that we see at Persepolis. Now, for a major campaign, a professional standing army could be combined with additional forces assembled at the frontier to try to give a large military force. And again, we see some evidence for the hiring of mercenaries among Greeks, among Arabs, among Indians and Saka and other frontier populations who could simply be recruited and paid temporarily by imperial authorities. But there's also evidence for an extensive draft conscription system. We saw in Babylonia this is especially tied to professions or to land ownership, and it functions as a kind of tax on human labor. That is, if you own or rent a farm that comes with a military service obligation, every year or every few years, you would have to provide a soldier. You might contract with an individual who wants to engage in military service and basically pay that substitute to do your military service for you. So that means that conscripts tied to land taxation might actually be military veterans with some level of experience or access to military equipment that they could bring along for a campaign. That is all we're going to do for today. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about the beginning of Darius's engagement with the Greeks, the Ionian Revolt, and Persia's overseas Greek campaigns.